Great. And then live on Facebook.
Is it up?
Yeah, okay. Why don't I use this now as an opportunity to introduce the speaker and the campaign. Let me just make sure that this is running. Okay. Ugh. All right. So, welcome to the Uri L'Tzedek anti-racism campaign webinar number 3. We are honored to be here with Rabbi Yonason Perry. Before I introduce Rav Perry, I just want to discuss the campaign in further detail. So I'm Donnie Satlow. I am Uri L'Tzedek's programming officer. And I would like to say a few words about the campaign before moving forward with the actual webinar. So why are we running a campaign to combat racism within the Orthodox Jewish community? As Ella and Nehorai discussed in the previous webinar, all of them which are found on our website, many of the talking points of white nationalism have creeped up in the discourse of many in Orthodox synagogues throughout the United States, with right-wing pundits such as Dennis Prager and Ben Shapiro serving as primary sources of information. And combined with the pale skin color of most American Ashkenazi Jews, there have been a general othering of many of our congregants of color. And while the reality is quite complex, as Rabbi Shais Rishon explained in our first webinar, these two elements, the coupling between an ideology that embraces whiteness and the lack of awareness that non-white Jews exist, has concerned us enough to address the issue through a year-long campaign. This campaign, which consists of 3 parts, is designed to raise awareness of the issue and inspire us to help combat this ideology, both from within and outside the Jewish community. The 3 parts of the campaign are signing a pledge expressing the need to call out the racist behavior of people in our institutions, a resource page with many materials intended to inform readers about race in America today and how it manifests itself in our world, and an 8-part webinar series that will run over the course of this year. So this webinar series will follow a narrative arc, with the first 2 that we already had, analyzing the problem of race in the Orthodox community today in more depth. The middle 4, unpacking both the Torah's refusal to promote bigotry amongst fellow Jews and the complexities of race within the Jewish tradition. And the last 2, which will be in October and December, so we got a while to go, will be more focused on potential strategies for making us better equipped to deal with the present realities at hand. And for the first 2 webinars, Rabbis Shais Rishon and Elad Nehorai analyzed the problem of race within the Orthodox community from 2 separate standpoints. Well, Rabbi Rishon analyzed how he has been affected in the Orthodox community based on the color of his skin. Elad focused on how white nationalist rhetoric has creeped into the discourse in many Orthodox communities throughout the United States. Both sessions were recorded and are available on our website for those interested in catching up on the entire discussion. This session, however, will be a little bit different. Here, Rabbi Yonason Perry will be focusing on what the halakha, or Jewish legal tradition, says about racism, and how our institutions can be better equipped, and us ourselves can be better equipped to combat racism in the synagogue or other Jewish spaces. So a little bit about our speaker. Rav Jonathan or Yonason Perry is a Los Angeles-based rabbi of the Chabad-Lubavitch movement. Born in Tucson, Arizona, to an Ashkenazi mother and non-Jewish African-American father, Yonason, or Jonathan, was raised in a secular family with little interaction with the Jewish community. At the age of 19, he accepted a life of Torah observance after being introduced to the Chabad-Lubavitch movement. Jonathan spent the next several years in the Lubavitch yeshiva in Morristown, New Jersey. During the time, he traveled to various yeshivot for the purpose of speaking to the students about the detriment of internal racism within the Orthodox Jewish community. After a cello audition landed him a seat in the symphony orchestra at the University of Arizona, Jonathan relocated to Tucson and completed his degree in music business with a minor in Judaic studies. He went on to receive Smicha, or rabbinical ordination, from Rav Nachman Wilhelm and Rav Dovid Shochat through the online program Machon L'Horaah. He and his wife have written several articles pertaining to race from the perspective of the Jewish community. Jonathan currently lives in Los Angeles, California, and he and his family are active members of the Jewish community. So after this introduction, which I've gone for a little bit too long, Rav Perry will present 30 to 40 minutes, followed by questions. Anyway, Rav Perry, the floor is now yours.
All right, can you hear me okay? Is it picking up well? Okay, great. First of all, I want to thank you guys for having me, but for hosting this and for essentially making a platform where this discussion could be more internal than on a more like world public, platform. That we're specifically discussing internally within the Jewish community, and it's based on essentially the perspective according to within the Jewish community, specifically the Frum community. I think a big part of the maybe the reason why there aren't as many Jews of color found often inside the Frum communities because maybe they don't feel comfortable, and they're maybe more comfortable in other organizations. So I think by specifically discussing this within the Frum crowd, then hopefully we could fix that and have people of color feel more comfortable amongst their own, that being the Jewish people. So to kick it off, essentially, I want to go through several halachas and different things from Nigla that basically discuss matters that you can often find to be like either the root problem or solution for, or things that would bother your fellow Jew. And so in this case, I'm specifically speaking about Jews of color, right? It could be an entirely different conversation. I actually chose not to even delve in it in this presentation because I feel like discussing racism and any kind of poor treatment of others that's related to outside of the Jewish community, specifically relations with Jews and non-Jews and Jews with non-Jews of color, is an entirely longer discussion. I wanted to get specific about the way that Jews of color feel, or Black Jews, or I can really only speak specifically from personal experience as a Black Jew, not as it pertains to Hispanics or Asians who are in the Jewish community. But I'm hoping that most of these halachas will discuss their treatment as well, essentially. So start off, I called my presentation Talmidav Shel Aaron from the Pirkei Avos. It says, it introduces Hillel, and it says that of Hillel. By the way, I'm going to do things mostly in English. The source sheet is in the chat, and that'll have Hebrew and English and different things. But for time's sake, I think that it's better if I just read the translations as I find them. So it says that Hillel used to say, "Be of the disciples of Aaron," Aaron being the high priest, Moshe Rabbeinu's brother, loving peace, pursuing peace, loving mankind, and drawing them close to the Torah. Now, specifically, the word that is used in this Mishnah is brios, which is creations. It doesn't say with Yisrael. So again, this also pertains to the scope of Jewish treatment of others, whether they be Jewish or non-Jewish. And so I'm not going to go that route. I'm going to stick with the, internally with Judaism, but just know that there's, based on this Mishnah alone, there obviously you can go in that branch as well. So,
here it is.
Somebody's mic is on. Okay. So, anyways, the first thing that I brought, the first halacha that I brought, past that, essentially is discussing what happens. A story with Hillel, where a convert comes, right? Convert shows up, and it's a famous story. First, he comes to Shammai, and he says, he convert me on the condition that you could teach me the entire Torah while I'm standing on one foot. Shammai basically shoot him off, and there's something to that. But to continue on with this Mishnah, he says, it's not a Mishnah, sorry, but he says that he then goes to Hillel, and it says who converted him, but he asks him the same question, and Hillel tells him, that which is hateful to you, don't do to anybody else. That's the entire Torah. The rest is its interpretation. Go study, right? So essentially, the importance that he gives on this mitzvah is the entire Torah. And what mitzvah is that? The mitzvah of ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, right? The mitzvah to love your fellow as you love yourself. So there's several interpretations of what that law means, right? So first I'm going to go to the pasuk Vayikra Yud Tes Yud Zayin in the source sheet to find it, and essentially says, Lo yisisna es achecha achicha b'vavcha haicheach techiach es amisecha v'lo yisisa alav chet. Says, you shall not hate your kinfolk in your heart, reprove your people, your fellow, but incur no guilt because of them. So I'm going to touch back on this and discuss what that last part means of incurring no guilt because of your fellow. But first I'm going to discuss the other interpretations of the Ahavta L'Reacha Kamocha. Right, so Rashi says that there's a problem with this idea that the treatment of to love your fellow as you love yourself, how that could be the entire Torah doesn't make sense, because there's two avenues through which our mitzvahs are categorized. Those that relate between man and fellow man, and on the other side of man as it pertains to man between God. So one explanation is that by saying it's the entire Torah, what Hillel meant was it's the entirety of that section of mitzvahs, right? And so then the next, let's see. Yeah, so that's the first explanation. Another explanation is that there's an illusion that Hashem is also your fellow. So by saying that you should also consider that Hashem, and so too applies to man and man, and also between man and Hashem. So that's both. So those are those two explanations. I'm going to circle back to an answer to kind of bring it all together. But first, I'm going to go on with more of these halachas and how they pertain to us. So that's the general halacha, right? To love your fellow like you love yourself. essentially all the mitzvahs that and all the halachas that apply to being kind to one another stem from this halacha. Okay. So specifically then, I'm going to go on to talk about hatred, being hateful, or causing hatred, right? One thing to say that you don't hate another person because of, their differences, whatever they may be. So specifically to our purposes, say a common thing that people who might be accused of having done something racially intolerant, they usually say, they defend themselves by saying, I don't hate people of another race. So this is good. This is a good start. But it's also important that if you are Jewish and you are having a conversation with other Jews, or another Jew might be able to hear it, you don't want to cause them to hate you. Correct? So if you're careful of the things that you say and you're careful not to offend anybody, it's one thing that you don't hate. That's good. To worry about yourself, that's good. But it's also important that you keep others from maybe disliking you or having a problem with you. So this halakha of not bearing sin because of somebody is, it also applies to that. So not only do you not want to be hateful, you also don't want to incur hate as well. So there's the importance of not hating one another is obviously paramount importance, but it brings in the Gemara I included in Shochat Yoma that it says that the second temple was destroyed because of sin of hate towards one another. So before even discussing different mitzvahs and different halachas that would, I guess, help one accomplish racial tolerance, even if they're unaware of it, because I think it was Chase who, in his presentation, was saying that a lot of times people don't realize what they're doing is making a Jew of color feel uncomfortable. A lot of times it's just a curiosity, or somebody may have good intentions. So some of these halachas are, I think, geared towards those who, I suppose they call it passive racism. So active racism obviously is, this isn't really the maybe official definition, but active racism is what we were discussing, or what most people would assume when they say a racist or having a racist incident happening. And passive racism is really like accidental racism, not being hateful or doing something offensive, but not being conscious of how it might still make others uncomfortable. So the example I heard was, being asked, "Oh, so how did you come to Judaism?" It's obviously not an insult or an offensive thing. I think it's important to specify that it's the recognition is there, because most of the time when there's a back and forth in regards to that, the person might respond, "That's not how I meant it. I'm just curious," or "I this," or what have you, whatever the explanation is. It's good to recognize, while we recognize that is not an offensive line of questioning outright, it's still uncomfortable. And so I'm going to go into some halachas that will kind of explain that further. Okay. So it says that, so I'm going to bring another pasuk. So Vayikra, it says, "V'lo yisaynu ish es amiseh v'yiresa me'elekecha ki ani Hashem elekecha." It says, "Do not wrong one another, but fear Hashem, for I am the Lord your God." This is going to come up in the Gemara here. So in Bava Metzia, it's this is actually a common one I've seen brought up. So he says that it says that it basically describes how terrible, embarrassing somebody is. Right. For the purpose of time, I'm not going to read it inside, but essentially describes the three things that a person can't do, and that will actually cause somebody to not return from Gehenna. Essentially, is what it says. And it says that one of the examples that he brings is adultery. It says that it's even better to have been to have done that than to embarrass somebody. Okay, so in terms of humiliating somebody, it's so important to avoid doing anything that might embarrass somebody, right? So again, the line of questioning, like I brought up earlier, it may not offend anybody, but it might embarrass somebody if they're in a bad situation, in a situation that makes them feel uncomfortable. And in fact, the Gemara even brings biblical proof. It brings the story of Tamar, where when she's being brought to execution for harlotry, and she could have just mentioned who it was that got her pregnant, but instead of doing it, even while they're marching her to her execution, what she does is she has the items of Yaakov and says, Yehuda, take these and bring them to the owner of these items. So she gave Yehuda the option to step up and to exonerate her. So it was so important not to embarrass Yehuda that she refrained even from basically calling him out in order to save her own life. It was better to have taken death than to have even risked embarrassing somebody. So that's where that comes from. That concept comes from that pasuk from Torah, the whole situation of Torah, right? So, and he says, so that's from basically more of the midrashic piece of that Gemara. But the Mishnah itself, it says, I'm going to do it in English, it says just after discussing taking advantage of somebody else in monetary matters, right? It goes through different things that you don't want to wrong somebody. One of those could even be going into a market or attempting to buy or feigning to buy something when you have no money. So that's just an example of how you could be wronging somebody in a monetary way. And then it goes on to say that not only is there oina is the word, to wrong somebody, exploit somebody, what it says. Not only does it occur or does it apply to monetary things, but it says also with words, statements. So a person can't say a Baal Tshuva or to say to a Baal Tshuva, remember when you did such and such, right? Or to say to a convert, remember when you did such and such, or even the descendant of converts, remember when your people did this or did that. You're not allowed to do that to oppress the person. This goes on people who are Jewish and just a Baal Tshuva, or a convert who's Jewish by conversion. So either way, this is where that leads to. Okay, so I'm gonna go into all of these halachas and these things are very general halachas, but they are specific to our situation. But the halachas that I'm going to go into now are not shaykh specifically, not relevant specifically to our topic, but you'll see why I'm bringing them. So the first Mishnah of Chulin describes slaughtering. It says that everyone can slaughter. Okay, so I posted here the Tosafos, the first Tosafos in this Chulin, which Tosafos was a commentary on the Gemara here. He brings Kasav Behilchos Eretz Yisrael. The Nashim lo yishchatu mipnei shedatim kalos. Ve'ein nira da'afilu b'mukadshim shochtes l'chatchila. So he's saying, so the Tosafos says here that according to Hilchos Eretz Yisrael, it says that women can't shech because of their thoughts, that their thoughts might be somewhere else. And it says the explanation on that, what that means is they might be faint from the slaughtering, so that their thoughts might be faint. It says weak, essentially. So he says, so what the Eretz Yisrael, the Hilchos Eretz Yisrael, by the way, the Tosfos then goes on to say that he disagrees with this position, but essentially the Eretz Yisrael comes from somebody by the name of Eldad Hadani. Eldad Hadani was a traveler, a Jewish traveler, and a scholar, really, who ended up in the 9th century. He ended up in the yeshivas in Babylon, and he traveled to the Iberian Peninsula, so Spain, and he ended up in the yeshiva in North Africa. So the major points of scholarship of the time, he shows up on the scene, essentially, and he tells the story that he is from this African kingdom that is entirely Jewish, and that they're descendants of the tribe of Dan, and they have their own halachas. They don't have the book of Esther, obviously, because the 10 tribes were dispersed before the story of Esther took place. They don't have those stories that happened after the first Galus. After the first Churban. So he tells all this story about how he got to where he is, and the stories about their home and all the 10 tribes, the other 10 tribes that they're in contact with, as he says, on the other side of the river of Kush in Africa. So here you have a person who is of black ancestry. He's a darker person. He comes to these yeshivas and he says, I'm from the tribe of Dan. We live in Africa. I know where all the other tribes are. We have our own set of halachas. We do everything according to the Torah, and we also have an oral tradition. Now, what's interesting is they have an oral tradition, but some of them differ, right? The interesting thing is here that they wrote to the Gaon at the time. The Gaon in the Babylonian yeshiva was Rav Tzemach, and they asked him about the validity of his stories because of the the fanciful way of his stories were unbelievable. They weren't issues with the halachas, but some of his stories. So the Gaon wrote back that he doesn't know him personally, but he knows him to be credible based on other people that he knows that know of this person and his stories, and said that some of his stories might be embellished, or he might have, essentially what that means is some of the midrashic things that he studied, the Eldad Hadani studied, he incorporated into his telling because he used them to understand certain events that took place. Perfectly understandable thing that happens. And so he gave him credibility. So much so that here we have, he's quoted in the Tosfos in this Mishnah. He disagrees with his position. As I said, he had different customs and different laws, different halachas that he had brought from Africa, from his African kingdom, which he said comes back from the tribe of Dan. But he still brought him as a credible source, even if nothing more than to just disagree with him. Rashi mentions him. Avram ben Maimonides, Ben Rambam, he also quotes him he goes into an explanation in Kovitz Yad about the Aseret Shvat and the 10 tribes, and he mentions his story, Eldad Hadani's story. So here's a person who is from completely different background and shows up in places of Jewish scholarship in the year 850s, maybe, whatever, 9th century. And there was no problem. There was no issue of doubt as to his lineage or who he was. They treated him like a prince, it said, according to Avram ben Harambam. So I think this particular story is an important story of a Jewish person coming from a different ethnic looking background, showing up and being treated properly because these were sages. These were, this is the Gaonic times. They knew how to treat people. They knew what to do here. So they respected him and they honored his halachas, even if they were disagreeing with him. Okay, so I then went on to bring another Mishnah. I try to keep the Mishnayos that are not, or the halachas that are not really shy to the issue of race themselves together. So the next one I brought is Mishnah in Negayim. which is describing blemishes when figuring out what to do with sorrows, issues of sorrows, which was spiritual leprosy, right? So it says that the leprosy that we're discussing in the Torah is a leprosy that came about through spiritual calamity. And so the halachas of measuring them and figuring out if somebody is tameh, and if they're impure, if they are pure, when they're pure, all of these halachas are discussed. But in this Mishnah, right, so we're talking, it's a Mishnah, so it's certainly before the Gaonic times, the Amharic times, it's during the times of Tanaim, and it would have been written down. So this Mishnah of Negaim, which there is no Gemara to, I don't believe, but this Mishnah, it says, again, I'm going to do the English. It says a bright spot on a German. It says about Germany. Appears as a dull white spot in a Vakushi, in which we probably would have been referring to Ethiopian. Oimer, I'll just do the English. It says that it will appear as a bright white. So a dull white spot will appear bright on an Ethiopian. A bright one will appear dull on a German. So it's discussing how to measure the degree of the blemish. And so he goes on to say that Rabbi Yishmael said the children of Israel are like boxwood, not black, not white. They're in intermediate color, right? He says, so Rabbi Akiva, he says, there are painters who have the ability to make colors, the color of different, shades, should, just like they have paint to portray black people or white people, and they can make an intermediate shade to match the skin tone of the Hebrew people, right? So he says that they should make a paint the color of that skin tone and paint it around the blemish on the person, so that they could compare the blemish to the color of the skin tone from which that halacha was based on. So that's Rabbi Akiva's idea. And then he says, so that was skin tone. The Buddha says that the law should be lenient and not stringent. So therefore, the blemishes on a German should be inspected on, should be on the color of his own skin, and that the Ethiopian can be inspected against the color of the intermediate shade. So that way the law will be lenient. So I bring all that up, first of all. So we're describing different skin tones. It's one of the few cases, by the way, in Torah that complexion is mentioned, right? So there's diversity, and we're talking about measuring blemishes on people based on their skin tone and being accommodating for the different degree of blemishes according to each person. And so we have to be mindful of their skin tone and what that might mean if we're basing the degree of blemish on the color and the type of color. So the very next Mishnah, the third one, I'm only going to read the first little bit here. He says, everyone can become impure from these blemishes except for a non-Jew. So the understanding here is if a non-Jew can't fall ill from this spiritual blemish that we were discussing, and who is it discussing in the previous Mishnah when it's measuring the color of the blemish against a white skin, a German or a white skin, or a Kushi with a darker skin, right? The only explanation is that there were Jews of those backgrounds back then, almost 2,000 years. So we have here proof that there was Jewish diversity during these times, and there were laws that basically accommodated each person, right? Another thing, commonly pointed out that there is a Mishnah that describes different things that will cause a person to be considered invalidated for the kahuna, for a priestly service. One of those things says dark skin, and another Mishnah says even more specifically kushi. So it's important to note that it's more than, it's not a racial issue so much as it is an ordinary issue, right? So the people there at the time, what was normally seen was people of the intermediary color. And so seeing somebody dark skinned or black was considered a rarity. To the point that it says that there's a bracha you make, Shani Abrius, bracha on seeing something that is unusual. It says that if you see a person who's unusual, and the Mishnah says specifically, a spotted person, but they respond, there's a meisvei that says specifically black person, that you would also say this bracha, because that's an unusual thing to see. So essentially people who were able to do the kahuna had to be people that looked ordinary. You couldn't be too tall, couldn't have a pot belly, you couldn't be short. If you had a unibrow, if you needed glasses, there's a lot of things that would invalidate a person for kahuna. So this isn't a hateful halacha, but it's important to note that if they were saying specifically kushi, it doesn't say shcharim. It said shcharim first in this first Mishnah describing what invalidates a person for the kahuna, for the priestly service. The next one says kushi. So how could we be discussing black priests or black kohanim not being eligible for the kahuna if they didn't exist? So of everything that's enumerated and discussed in Gemara, in Torah Sheba'al Peh, Torah Sheba'Ksav, everything that we have, there's not a single Jim Crow law there. So we clearly see that there's been Jewish diversity, and there's many laws. I'll touch a little bit on convert as well, like the description of how to treat the convert, that it says, all of these laws that we have, and there's nothing that's actually discriminatory towards black or towards Jews of any other, background. So I think what's important here is when discussing racism in halacha and Jewish tradition, the lack of these discussions and these things that come up within the whole span of Torah is the message that it's not a Jewish tradition. It's not Jewish to behave in a way that is hateful by another person, especially the convert. So it says that specifically of converts, there's several halachas that discuss protecting the convert, to do things that everything that you do is, there's also more halachas on top of the halacha of Jew and another Jew. There's the added halachas of Jew and a convert. And it says that there was the only somewhat discriminatory halachas regarding converts was that there were 4 nations that were not allowed to convert. It's brought in the Rambam that because of the mixing of the nations, that no one nation is truly that nation. So those laws pertaining to those nations not joining the fold of the Jewish people don't apply anymore. I also like to point out that when it comes to the issues of lineage, which is where that halacha comes from, it's Mishnah Torah Surah Bia that discusses those laws that I just mentioned with the convert and how to treat them. And one thing I know, finding somebody's yichus is important from a halachic standpoint in regards to marriage, mostly, and the validity of a child, who the child belongs to. Is the child themselves a Jew? Are they a non-Jew? If the mother was not Jewish, all of these issues. But one of the things it says is that this is one of the times. This is when you search a person's yichus is for these matters. There are other matters. There are other specific matters that it's relevant to know about somebody's yichus. One of them, though, is not a minyan. If the assumption is that a person is Jewish, then the minyan holds. And it's not until you have a suffix, if you have a doubt on a person's yichus, or somebody brings a question on that person's lineage, that you do some research. So I had a situation where I walked into a shul, hat and jacket, and was met by a young guy also in a hat and jacket who asked me if my mother was Jewish, right? Which is just odd. I've been asked before about my legitimacy, but that was an odd way to put that. But in general, when asking somebody these questions, again, if it's for a halachic reason, forget it. It's not important in terms of, so the other issue might be if you're maybe curious and you want to know, I think the best route to go about is to try to get to know the person, be friendly with the person, and get that person to then, maybe over time to tell you their story if you really want to know it so bad. But there shouldn't be a singling out of people in any way, shape, or form because they maybe look different. And I think most of these halachas support that. There's more. Kind of wanted to save a little bit of time here still, but essentially, what I want to do really, how I want to end this is to go back to the initial issue of the Ahavta L'Reacha Kamocha being the entire Torah, and kind of bringing those two ideas together. So it says in the Tanya from the Alter Rebbe, the Shner Zalman Riyadi, first Chabad Rabbi, in the book of Tanya, he discusses this issue. And what he says is that so while one opinion says that it's a claw, it's the entire Torah as it pertains to man and man, and then the other explanation is, well, you could consider God also your fellow, your chavere, so this is also applies to both, and then maybe that's how you could bring the concept together. But the Alter Rebbe says that specifically the way Hillel HaZaken says it is exactly what he means, that it's the entire Torah. And why that is because in order to love yourself truly in a way that you can love another the same way is by de-emphasizing the body. It says that Jewish people are an entire entity, one entity, and one neshama, and the separations come only in this physical world. That the world is where we see these differentiations between one another, and that if you de-emphasize the body and you emphasize the soul and live according to that being the emphasis, then we're us all being one soul. A person is truly able to love their fellow as they love themselves, because they recognize that we're all one neshama. And the reason that is Kol Torah Kula, the entire Torah, is because the purpose of the Torah is to elevate oneself to our source, which is Hashem, and that recognition that we're all one, and then bringing it back down into this physical world. So most of the time when we have discussions on race, a common thing that I hear is, I don't see race, the colorblind argument, right? So this concept from the Alter Rebbe would say, but that's not the way. That's not the answer. The answer is above the physical body. You recognize that we're all one neshama. Then you bring that reality back down to the physical reality, to the world that you live in, and treat others according to that. So that the body, not that the body doesn't exist, but that it's secondary, right? A person's background being something different from yours, that's secondary. All of these things create the ability for somebody to love their fellows, they love themselves, and that's the explanation on that piece. And then I just wanted to say one thing about, or maybe I'll go to questions, and then I'll maybe tailor it off for the closing statement.
Hello. So I actually have a question before I can turn it over to everyone else. I guess it's moderator's privilege. But one of the things I'm curious about is like these discussions of race and racism within the Jewish community. How much do you think they extend outside the Jewish community? Right. I mean, I'd say that kind of one of the things that when I read the Tanya, one of the things that most strikes me is kind of this differentiation between the Jewish and the non-Jewish soul, right? So kind of, I'm curious as to kind of how in your training, your approach to racism within the Jewish community has differed from approaches to racism without the Jewish community, just by being kind of, dark-skinned in America today. And kind of, how much are these two things connected?
Okay, so I was putting together pieces to.
That's what the president told us not to do.
And there's somebody from Fox channel. I'm gonna stop seeing it because stop watching that channel.
Anyways, I don't know if you can still hear me or not, but
yeah, here.
So,
okay, I muted.
Okay, great. Okay, so to answer the question, there are differences between Jews and non-Jews. I think, if we're talking about ethnic backgrounds and race and everything like that, as they pertain to within the Jewish fold, then all of those things should go by the wayside, obviously. But even in regards to the way we treat non-Jews, and one of those issues would be if they're completely different race and ethnicity and from a different background than people that you know or people you're used to or people you look like, for example, then I think there are still ways that it's important to treat them well, just as it pertains to your relationship with other Jews, right? So one of the things that I stressed when I would go to some of these yeshivas, these Masifta age, specifically go to the high school age, is I would say that, I'm a Baal Tshuva, and as a Baal Tshuva, the first time I came around from people, they were, Chabad guys that grew up in it. They had a lot of responsibility because they were my first representation of essentially, Orthodox Judaism, Torah Judaism. And had they been somebody that I witnessed, treating somebody poorly or talking poorly about other people, specifically for me, it would have bothered me because my connection growing up was really with the Black community. And so had I come around and heard somebody, spewing garbage about, especially my own people, that would have been a problem. And that would have, for all we know, could turn somebody away from Torah for good, Torah and mitzvahs. And here you have an entire neshama because of that person. The responsibility lies on that person for having done something wild in shul or in the street or in business. So part of my whole argument that I would put together or that I was putting together for this was that half of the way that we interact with non-Jews has in and of itself two issues: how they pertain to Kiddush Hashem and Chilul Hashem amongst other Jews, how they view us, and also how we're viewed by the non-Jewish world. And essentially, there's issues with like Ava, where we have to we specifically with regard to like burying, for example, if we see their dad, see the deceased of a non-Jew, and nobody's taking care of that person, we have the ability to, we're told to bury them and take care of them as we would our own. And so some of the explanations of that is we have to treat non-Jews the same way as we treat each other because of fear. You know, we don't want them to be violent because we're not treating them well. And obviously this isn't the popular reason. This shouldn't be the main reason. The main reason should be out of love. As I started my presentation with the idea of Talmid Shel Aaron, and Hillel says, treat everyone with kindness to bring them back to Torah. He uses the word brias, creations, that we're supposed to treat everybody with kindness. So the reason should just be common decency and love. But there are even explanations as to, not doing it, not treating non-Jews differently for our own protection. And we see that a lot of hatred in the Jewish community or toward the Jewish community, particularly from the Black community, comes from the way that we treated them. It's important to note that, especially with regards to Blacks, that you don't see them up in arms in the Black leadership and people with more of a voice from the Black community. We don't see them having such a time against the Ku Klux Klan and David Duke. They're not up in arms about them not liking or being kind towards Blacks. The biggest complaint is on us. I think it's a testament to the fact that we're supposed to be held to a higher standard, and we're supposed to treat people differently than the average person. Especially, we're supposed to represent Hashem. Make Kiddush Hashem, then how can we do that? By treating everybody with kindness. And that's all very much emphasized in Torah.
Okay, great. So I think we have time for 2 more questions. Since it's such a small group, anyone who wants to, feel free to unmute and ask your question.
Can anybody hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so I was wondering, Jonathan, if you've noticed any difference generationally from younger Jews versus older Jews in terms of racism, and whether or not you see any improvement happening among younger Jews.
So I think the general active racism is still present in the younger generations, particularly, unfortunately, in the film community. I think passive racism is a harder issue to fight, but I think active racism is still prevalent in the younger generation. I think the older generation, it might even have been a little bit more like, I don't know if accidental is the right word, but it's almost worse that it happens now because in the social climate, racism isn't so tolerated, So it almost makes it worse. Good question.
Here, we have a question in the comments that I'm just going to read right now so that everyone can see. Since the
I
rule
figured it would take some time.
Okay, I'll read it. Right, since the rule for priestly service tied to what's commonly seen, and thus presumably where individual disqualifications can easily be distinguished from a group characteristic, which might be typical to them and not disqualifying, wouldn't it have been the case that in the Cushite Jewish community, a white Jew could not serve, since they would be uncommon and thus couldn't have disqualifications properly identified?
Awesome question. In fact, the same Mishnah says also white skin disqualifies a person from the kahuna. So black skin and white skin, if they had the same Mishnah as we do, for sure they would have seen that. Because either way, dark black skin and very white skin were considered disqualifying features. But for sure, yeah, that's an awesome question.
All right. We have time for one more question. All right, anyone else? I have one. And I'm warning you, this one is a little bit half formulated, so just giving you the heads up about that. I'm curious about your stance towards kind of how halacha plays out in the state of Israel, right? So now that Jews are actually a majority in a sovereign Jewish nation state, do you think that influences the way that the halachot that you taught should be enforced or discussed?
Can you tell me why it would be different in the way that it's applied there than it would be applied here, especially?
Yeah, I mean, right. No, it's right. So I would say that it's a little bit, right, in Israel, right, when the Jewish nation state, right, when Judaism is enforced as a nation state, right? So here in our communities, right, halakha is seen as something that we do in our communities, and then we are enforced by a separate type of law, right? And I don't think that it is that clear in Israel, right? So kind of
that halakhas should influence the laws in the state of Israel?
Right, exactly, right? Right. So when it's the case where halachot are not as firmly distinguished from the actual laws and decisions made by people in government, right? I mean, an example that I have off the top of my head is they recently had, around a year ago, Ethiopian Israelis protesting police brutality, right? Right. So if everyone was Jewish, right, then honestly, I think people in the police force need this halacha shir, right? But how can we use this use these halachot and impose them in a place where the halacha is closer to actual law and backed in power?
I mean, I honestly don't know really. I'm not familiar enough with how much, what the separation between, religion and state is in Israel in terms of the laws, the actual governing laws. But I'm a big advocate for Mashiach coming and establishing officially in the land of Israel, and obviously halachas and Torah being the rule, the law of the land anyway. Then it won't be an issue, God willing.
Okay, great. So
other than that, I just don't know so much about the the political, like how much they can put halachas into the law. But it sounds to me like it's very necessary. I think in general these halachas for the entire Jewish world, whether it be in Israel or outside of Israel, if we could treat each other and non-Jews as well better in general, as I said in Yuma, that was the reason for the destruction and the current gullus. That's I think obviously Yisrael is the biggest thing we need to push right now.
Okay, great. So let me just conclude. I mean, first off, I just wanted to thank Rabbi Perry for presenting. So I really appreciated this this shir, and I found it really great and deeply insightful. I just wanted to give everyone a heads up for the next webinar. So we'll continue next month on a date to be determined with Rabbi David Jaffe, who will discuss how to use Musar to be better able to deal with the complexities of race and how to implement that in your respective communities. Right, so if you're looking for a way to know how to implement the laws on the books that Rabbi Perry described, right, the next webinar is definitely the one for you. And furthermore, if you have not done so already, please feel free to take the anti-racism pledge on our website at www.utzedek.org. That's utzedek.org. And thank you all for listening, and I hope you all have a good afternoon and a good night.
All right, thanks.
Shkoyach.